Egypt. Power. The most solitary thing in the world is not death, but the throne. The Pharaoh was law, order, the living sun on earth. Yet what is the price of divinity? And what sleeps in the shadow of the one who proclaims himself a god? In this journey, we unravel the Pharaoh's shadow, the silent psychological weight every leader carries, from the rulers of ancient empires to modern CEOs, when the role demands perfection. The Pharaoh is not a man. He is the peak of the collective persona. His duty is to embody divine perfection, suppressing every trace of humanity and fallibility. He is the archetype of absolute authority. Through the lens of Jung, we descend into the burden of the collective shadow projected onto him. His path becomes an eternal metaphor for the search for wholeness, the self, for the courage to hold the wisdom born from union, from Logos and Eros, and for the longing to reclaim the inner voice stolen by the tyranny of power. This is not merely a story, it is a descent into Jungian psychology. His fate mirrors our own, the struggle to integrate what has been silenced. Here we sink into the very collective shadow that condemned him, society's fear of intuition and of the mysterious power of feeling. And we witness how his true strength did not rise from outer forgiveness, but from the inner integration of the self, totality. If you seek to understand the strength that lives in wholeness, and if you feel the call of your own awakening, don't walk this journey alone. Subscribe now to Shadow Work Stories so YouTube recognizes the depth of this work and continues guiding you through your own path of individuation. Leave your like and let us uncover the mystery of absolute power. The first and deepest act of violence against the Pharaoh wasn't physical at all. It was a collective psychological projection. The Pharaoh was never merely an individual. He was the peak of the collective persona Egypt, society, and the dogma of that age desperately needed to create and to preserve. He became the scapegoat of excellence. His purpose wasn't only to rule, but to be the facade of order, purity, and rigid hierarchy, a mask that kept an entire civilization tranquil. And this demand unleashed a brutal repression on a macro scale. Everything society feared, chaos, fallibility, uncontained emotion, unruly death, doubt, fragile humanity, was pushed into the collective unconscious and, by a strange psychological paradox, projected back onto the Pharaoh himself. Carl Jung taught us that the collective shadow is the vast reservoir of traits, instincts, and powers a society or an entire era refuses to acknowledge within itself. It was the unconscious of a civilization. In that emerging world, the dogma of power was excessively rational, structured, and masculine, the principle of Logos. And Logos feared, above all, the undomesticated force of Eros, intuition, deep feeling, direct connection, the sacred pulse of nature. Society projected its craving for order onto the Pharaoh, giving the people the illusion of safety and the privilege of avoiding responsibility for their own greatness. The Pharaoh, in turn, was commanded to deny himself. The collective shadow, made of rigidity, fear of vulnerability, fear of emotional chaos, was emptied onto him. By elevating him to divinity, that is, to something non-human, society could soothe itself with a lie. The danger is not in our repression, nor in our rules. The danger lies in him, in what he must never be." And with that, they stripped him of the deepest human experience. The cost was the annihilation of his identity. He could no longer be seen as a man, a father, a complex soul. He was reduced to a one-dimensional symbol, a god mask. Society, blinded by its own shadow, couldn't see the whole man, the bearer of totality. They saw only the reflection of their hunger for rigid order and their repressed longing to be perfect. To Jung, this mechanism becomes macro, a civilization fleeing its own intuitive and emotional side. By condemning the Pharaoh to perfection, they were unconsciously condemning the human soul inside every individual. This wasn't a moral judgment. It was a cold act of psychological survival. It forced the Pharaoh to carry the archetypal wound of the repressed spiritual masculine. His pain was the pain of every leader throughout history whose humanity was labeled weakness or incompetence. The empire was healing itself at the cost of his psychic fragmentation. The rigidity of the persona, the facade of divinity, made it impossible to integrate instinct, doubt, rage, the true shadow. Repression turned inward, becoming a destructive force. The Pharaoh became his own jailer. His cost was the endless battle between the truth of his self and the lie of his imposed persona. How could he carry the message of totality if society itself had carved his soul in half, leaving only inflexible perfection? This was his cross. Society had stolen his right to human complexity. The denial of shadow and Eros produces an excess of logos. The Pharaoh transforms into an automaton of rituals and laws, each gesture calibrated to avoid spontaneity or human vulnerability. The palace and temples, with their flawless, immutable geometry, were the architecture of an imprisoned ego. His only outlet for unclaimed rage, cruelty, or doubt, his unowned shadow, was projection. He projected the threat of chaos onto foreign nations, onto outsiders, onto his own viziers, turning them into scapegoats for the evil he refused to see within. Repressed weakness becomes outward tyranny. A shadow unintegrated corrupts power, makes it cruel, makes it blind. Yet within this extreme conflict lies the key to his real power. The Pharaoh story is not merely tragedy, it is the spark of individuation. He was struck so deeply by the collective shadow that he was forced to descend into his own unconscious, seeking a truth untouched by external judgment. The temple, in its solitude, became both battleground and sanctuary. He wasn't ruling, he was confronting, for the first time, the enormous lie society built to steal his soul. The dogma of logos, rational, structured, hierarchical, demanded that he be the living denial of change. He had to be timeless, like the pyramids. This psychic rigidity was a shield against entropy and death. By identifying solely with logos, he became the masculine principle in its most tyrannical state, the one that destroys feeling in the name of law. The repression of his instincts, his shadow, turned into toxic psychic energy that poisoned the empire. The Pharaoh could not weep, so the land wept for him, through floods, through famine, through disease. That is synchronicity, the unconscious of the ruler manifesting in the outer world. What he could not integrate, the world enacted. The persona of the Pharaoh, though majestic, was a cold armor. Every ritual, every proclamation, every decree was a defense mechanism against the possibility of a spontaneous thought, a human doubt, a moment of tenderness. If he slipped even once, the entire projected structure of empire would collapse. He was the axis of the cosmos, yet trapped at the center of his own psyche. The forced exile of his Eros and the isolation it created pushed him to internalize totality. What the world sought to punish, his soul was preparing to integrate. His final act of courage wouldn't be to challenge the dogma publicly, but to reclaim the collective shadow from within, purifying his identity and beginning the journey back to his own truth. This path, separating the self from the collective shadow, is the most powerful message he carries into the modern world. At the height of his loneliness and repression, the Pharaoh was about to discover that his strength did not come from denying his shadow, but from the courage to embrace it. He was the most powerful man on earth. But what happens when the mask cracks and the shadow can no longer be contained? The Pharaoh needed a sacrifice, and that sacrifice was always his own humanity. The severing from the master, the isolation, forced him to absorb totality within. But to carry this truth, to bear the weight of wholeness, the Pharaoh needed one final certainty, that his wisdom matched the power of the law. He had to confront the animus, the masculine principle within his own soul, to prove himself worthy of the truth he had received. And that moment was about to unfold. The Pharaoh's reign is the absolute tyrannical dominion of Logos. His very existence is living proof that the dogma of his age was unbearably rational, rigid, and masculine. Everything becomes order, law, hierarchy, a psychic armor mirroring the imprisonment of his ego. The Pharaoh's Logos feared, above all, the untamed force of Eros, the principle of deep feeling, connection, intuition, and vulnerability. The empire condemned him to perfection, stealing from him the right to human complexity. This condemnation was a psychological survival instinct of the civilization, which needed to project its terror of chaos onto the body of its leader, forcing him to repress his instinctive and emotional nature. This forced split between Logos and Eros is the birthplace of the ruler's eternal solitude. The Pharaoh is the most powerful man on earth, and yet he cannot form a single genuine human bond. He has subjects and worship, but no love. Love is replaced by rule, affection by ritual. Absolute power becomes a crystal prison where the persona, the God mask, is so rigid that the soul cannot breathe. In Jungian terms, the animus is the masculine presence within the feminine psyche, the inner faculty of reason, discernment, and spiritual authority. In the Pharaoh, this energy, which in men aligns with the integration of gnosis, intuitive knowing, is overdeveloped, becoming tyrannical. By condemning him to the perfection of Logos, society not only repressed his Eros, but disqualified his animus from validating intuitive truth, insisting that truth could come only from external law, the dogma. The Pharaoh carries the archetypal burden of the repressed spiritual masculine. He is trapped in a relentless inner war between the truth of his self and the lie of his imposed persona. How could he carry the message of wholeness when society itself had cut his soul in half? Yet within this extreme conflict lies the key to his power. The Pharaoh's story is not merely a tragedy, it is the spark of individuation. He is forced to descend into his own unconscious to find a source of truth untouched by external judgment. The severing of his Eros, the isolation surrounding him, pushes him to internalize totality. What the world sought to punish, his soul was preparing to integrate. His final act of courage would not be a public rebellion against dogma, but the quiet retrieval of the collective shadow within himself. The rigidity of his logos pushes him into a crisis of certainty. The Pharaoh must prove to himself that his wisdom, his intuitive gnosis, is as valid as the law. For the self to rise, he must integrate his animus, not to become more rigid, but so that inner reason may confirm the truth his heart, his repressed Eros, already knows. This is what sets him apart. He needs reason to bless faith. The strength he once used to defend the dogma was never superficial rebellion. It was the masculine principle in his soul trying to break free from the tyranny of the persona. The path home, the path toward the soul, requires the union of feeling and reason. The Pharaoh had conquered the Nile and the desert, yet the only land he could not rule was the terrain of his own soul. And in that inner wilderness, in the solitude of his self, he finally met the only mirror of his humanity, the bearer of the sacred feminine, his inner daughter. But to carry this message of wholeness, the Pharaoh needed one final certainty. He had to prove to himself that his wisdom matched the power of the law. He had to confront the animus, the masculine principle within his own soul, to prove himself worthy of the truth he had received. And that moment was about to unfold. The Pharaoh had reached the outer wall of his logos. Reason, law, and the rigid persona had carried him into absolute solitude, but never into wholeness. For the self, the unified center of the psyche, to emerge, he needed the very principle he had exiled in the name of empire. Eros, intuition, connection, the archetype of the anima. The repression of Eros was the original crime against his soul. The anima, the feminine presence within the masculine psyche, is the mediator between ego and the collective unconscious. And when she is neglected or silenced, she does not disappear, she erupts. In ordinary men, she surfaces as mood swings or sentimental distortion. But in the Pharaoh, such repression could only take one form: projection. His anima was projected onto a woman near him, a counselor, a younger wife, or metaphorically, a daughter. She was not merely loved, she was the archetypal vessel carrying everything he had banished from the palace: tenderness, emotional depth, intuition, and above all, gnosis, the knowing born not from logic, but from soul. She was the mirror of all he had sacrificed to maintain the unbreakable mask of divinity. The encounter with this woman is, in truth, the Pharaoh's encounter with his own shadow and his long-exiled Eros. She is the direct challenge to his tyranny of logos. Where he offers law carved in stone, she offers wisdom written in the heart. Where he demands proof, she trusts inner certainty. As bearer of the anima, she confronts cold logic with the quiet authority of feeling, forcing the Pharaoh to question the infallibility of his own logos. Hers is the voice that whispers, "The order you enforce is only a mask. True order lives in the totality of being." For the Pharaoh, this truth is existentially dangerous. To accept her is to shatter the entire structure of his persona, to admit fallibility, to embrace the humanity he spent a lifetime killing in order to be God. Wholeness, the union of Logos and Eros, requires the death of an ego that worships reason alone. The Pharaoh's integration reaches its apex here. He is tempted to abandon divinity for a single human touch, to trade the crown for simple existence. She becomes the catalyst for his inner authority, but integration cannot happen through dependence. The final trial is internal. His inner reason, the animus, must validate the truth that his heart already knows. He cannot merely feel. He must discern. He must let the masculine principle within confirm what the feminine reveals. This is the crucial distinction. The same strength he once used to defend dogma against feeling now turns inward. It becomes the masculine principle rising against the tyranny of the persona. Logos must bow to Eros, not in submission, but in partnership. Only then can intuition be accepted as truth. By integrating Eros, the Pharaoh becomes the archetype of the whole man. He reaches the self. But the cost of wholeness is eternal solitude. The world around him, a world still fractured by its own collective shadow, cannot tolerate a complete human being. The priests and the people did not want a human god. They wanted a predictable one, a rigid one, a mirror of their own repression. The integrated Pharaoh becomes a threat because he no longer needs approval. He becomes his own authority, the most subversive act of all. He is met not with evil, but with misunderstanding. Old companions label him too emotional, too visionary. New words for the ancient rejection of the sacred feminine. He must make a radical choice, to abandon the need to be believed. Wholeness demands isolation. His faith must now rest entirely in his inner experience, not in the crown. Integrating Eros gave him life. The empire's rigid logos will drag him into crisis. The Pharaoh had integrated his animus and welcomed his anima. He had become the archetype of the whole man. But the world demanded that he return to the posture of submission and tears. And this demand rose like a plague, a storm of skepticism and disbelief. The shadow of power does not tolerate totality. What would he do when his newly found truth collided with the collective ego's perfect lie? He was about to step into the void of certainty. The Pharaoh had reached inner totality. Eros and Logos no longer at war, but woven into a single pulse. Yet to carry the truth of the self in a world still ruled by the fragmented collective shadow was unbearable. Union brought him clarity, but not companionship. It brought isolation. He now enters a new and frightening form of solitude. Not the solitude imposed by a rigid persona, but the void of certainty. The one who had sparked his awakening, the projected anima, the beloved, is gone, whether in body or symbol, and the Pharaoh is left to stand on his own center, unassisted, untouched. The same collective shadow that once called him divine and therefore not human, now returns as skepticism, as disbelief from priests and viziers. The Pharaoh holds certainty, the intuitive knowing of Eros, while the court demands proof, the factual evidence of dogmatic logos. The system wants him to bow once more to external law. He sees now that the truth he carries cannot be validated by those still chained to a divided mind. To them, he is too emotional, too visionary, new names for the ancient fear of the feeling principle. The void awakens the oldest terror in the psyche, the fear of final abandonment. Not just the loss of a person, but the fear of being abandoned by his own truth. And so the Pharaoh faces the most insidious doubt the mind can conjure. What if my gnosis, my inner knowing, was only illusion? This is the dark night of the ruler's soul, the moment when the seeker must confront the possibility that the entire journey was built on a lie. Jung would say this is the moment when the ego must shed its last projection. While the catalyst, the anima or consort, was present, there remained the danger that the Pharaoh projected his inner divinity, the self, onto her. Now, the emptiness forces him to reclaim that projection. He must prove that his faith rests in his own inner experience, not in any external source of power. And the dogmatic logos whispers, "Without proof, there is no truth." The Pharaoh is pushed into a radical choice: to abandon the need to be believed. He accepts that his truth is his own, and that the only authority that matters is the authority of his own soul. This movement into solitude is not an act of abandonment, it is an act of self-preservation. By withdrawing, he shelters the purity of his message from dogmatic judgment. The void left in isolation is not meaningless, it is simply free of external dependency. He becomes his own spiritual law. He is forced to confront the shadow of being utterly alone, the truth that the path of the soul is often a path walked by few. But the Pharaoh had tasted totality. His surrender to the void was not defeat, but victory over the ancient fear of not belonging. The emptiness inside the tomb of power was never a mystery to be solved by reason. It was a psychological command. It spoke, "Wholeness is not outside. Wholeness is within you." This was the true turning point of the Pharaoh's soul. But to free himself entirely from dependence, he still had to hear the final and most sacred command of autonomy, the "touch me not" of power. The Pharaoh had reached inner totality. Yet one final dependency lingered: the need for power, affection, or the beloved object to confirm his truth. The crisis of certainty had prepared him for the climax of his individuation, sealed in the most enigmatic command of all, "Noli me tangere," do not touch me. This was the threshold he could cross only alone. The encounter culminates in that phrase, "Noli me tangere." In analytical psychology, this is the final and essential lesson of freedom, the last veil he must lift to complete his individuation. The Pharaoh had sought reunion with power, glory, or the beloved in a physical, personal form, the love object. But now power, the self in its archetypal form, stood before him not as personal, but as transcendent. Jung would say, "This is the moment to withdraw the projection of the self from the external object. The physical touch no longer mattered. The bond had to evolve from the personal to the spiritual, from the human to the archetypal. If the Pharaoh touched the resurrected symbol of power, if he clung again to an external source of affection, he would regress into the old self, dependent, defined by presence, validated by another's gaze. He would return to being the ruler upheld by others, instead of the autonomous bearer of wholeness. The prohibition was not rejection. It was a command of autonomy. Do not cling to the old way of ruling or of needing. The proof of my presence is no longer in touch, but in the certainty awakened within you. Authority now resides in your own self. The Pharaoh had to transform passionate love, emotional dependency, adoration of power, into wisdom love, knowledge carried inwardly. This moment seals the final transmutation of his animus. Where once the animus supported his intuitive gnosis, now it must free him from all external anchors. Logos and Eros unite to teach him that totality cannot be transferred, borrowed, or held by the hand. It must be lived from within. By integrating the masculine and feminine, animus and Eros, he becomes the archetype of the whole man. He not only believes in the resurrection of the empire, he embodies its psychological meaning. The resurrected symbol of power reveals that life, the self, always rises beyond the death of the ego and the collapse of the persona. The Pharaoh no longer needs proof. He is the proof. Noli me tangere becomes his declaration of independence. He is no longer the dependent, no longer the captive of a divine mask. He becomes the free man who carries truth without intermediaries. His legacy is not biography, but permission, an invitation for others to seek the sacred within themselves. He becomes the first apostle of wholeness. He now holds unquestionable authority to carry the message. The physical separation ensures that his truth remains pure, untouched by the need for others to validate it. He alone understands the archetypal revelation, and this understanding marks him as the first witness of totality. The Pharaoh had completed the deepest of transformations, but to carry wholeness in a world of fragmentation was a burden. Where would he take his wisdom, and how would he protect it from the collective shadow that still stalked him? The Pharaoh had given us the key to totality, but the key must be used, and the answer lay in the sea, in the search for a place where truth could finally bloom. The Pharaoh had reached totality. He had woven logos with Eros, joined animus with anima, and accepted the fierce command of autonomy. Do not touch me. Yet carrying this wholeness in a world still shattered by the collective shadow was impossible. To preserve the purity of his gnosis, his direct, intuitive knowledge of the soul, he needed one final act of separation, the solitary journey. This journey, whispered in apocryphal legends, is the psychological epilogue of his story. The Pharaoh withdraws not out of fear, but out of spiritual duty. His new being, his message of inner wholeness, could not survive inside the rigid, dogmatic architecture of his own palace, still enslaved to tyrannical Logos. He had to travel toward a land where Eros could breathe again, where the feminine principle could root and bloom, far from the empire of reason. Jung saw the solitary path as the critical final stage of individuation, the moment when a soul must prove that its wholeness can stand without the scaffolding of the collective. For the Pharaoh, this meant boarding a vessel with no destination, trusting solely the intuitive principle he had reclaimed. He becomes, archetypically, the pilgrim, the one who carries sacred truth through the world. His fate leads him to the sea, water. The symbolism could not be deeper. The sea is the collective unconscious, the womb of creation, the realm of the primordial feminine. He was surrendering himself to the domain of his anima, leaving land-bound reason to follow water-borne intuition. He carries no scrolls, no laws, no decrees. He carries the legacy of feeling. His mission is not to convert by logos, but to plant the seed of totality in soil soft enough for it to grow. By living as the pilgrim, the Pharaoh embodies integration. He uses strength, the integrated animus, to navigate, but intuition, the integrated anima, to choose his path. His solitary existence becomes a living prayer, the quiet proof that true healing is self-generated and invulnerable to persecution. His final gift is not merely the search for the self, but the legacy of the shadow. By accepting his past, repression, and marrying it to his future, wisdom, he teaches us that redemption is not found in rejecting the dark, but in integrating it. Wholeness, the self, appears when we recognize divinity within our own humanity, with all its fractures and all its radiance. The Pharaoh's solitary journey was not exile. It was the materialization of his ultimate freedom. He was the first to prove that real authority belongs to the one who dares to be whole, even if that wholeness demands walking alone. He became totality, and his life became the message. The Pharaoh had completed the work. He left us the legacy of the shadow and the integrated self. Now his story becomes a mirror for ours. What did he do with his totality on that solitary path? And what will you do with the truth he left behind? The key lies in the radical acceptance of who you are, with every shadow, every light, and all the authority of the self. The Pharaoh had fulfilled the command of autonomy, noli me tangere, and in doing so, he transcended personal pain and became an archetypal legacy. His mission was no longer to seek outer power, but to become the messenger of totality. His body was now beyond the reach of touch, and his soul free from external dependence. His journey became living proof of the world's desperate need to reclaim Eros, feeling, connection, intuitive knowing. In an age crushed beneath the rigidity of logos, the masculine reason that divides, categorizes, and controls, where logos enforces hierarchy and separation, the Pharaoh's Eros insists on connection, on wholeness, on the sacred unity of being. The essence of his legacy is permission. Permission for intuition and feeling to be honored as spiritual authority. Permission for knowledge to be felt and not merely reasoned. Permission for a man, and for the Eros within every man, to be whole, without begging for external validation. The Pharaoh becomes the face of individuation for the masculine principle. His path proved that totality, the encounter with the self, is not a dogmatic privilege. It blossoms when one has the courage to integrate both the shadow, instinct, anger, forbidden emotion, and the animus, strength, discernment, into a unified being. His legacy teaches that strength is not the repression of doubt or fragility, as the collective shadow demands, but their integration. He proved that the man who accepts his vulnerability is the strongest of all, for he no longer fears the full breadth of his humanity. His separation from priests and viziers, though painful, was the guarantee that his message would remain pure. He carried the message of the body, the wisdom that spirit lives within matter, in defiance of the dogma that sought to deny the body and silence feeling. The Pharaoh's legacy does not belong to the past. It belongs to us. His story mirrors our own time, revealing how the modern collective shadow still fragments us. How often are we labeled weak or too emotional when we are simply expressing our inner anima, our rightful Eros? The Pharaoh's call is for each of us to reclaim the Eros we exiled, to trust intuition under the pressure of logic, to honor feeling as a legitimate form of wisdom. His legacy teaches that the most radical act of faith is often to believe in oneself. The Pharaoh, the pilgrim, continued his journey in silence. His life became legend because he reached what we all long for, the peace born from the radical acceptance of who one is, every shadow, every light, and all the authority of the self. The Pharaoh gave us the key to totality, but the key must be used. What does his journey through power and repression reveal about your own ego? His wisdom is an invitation. Which part of you has society forced into hiding? What power have you condemned to shadow in order to appear acceptable or strong? The key to your freedom is radical acceptance. The Pharaoh had completed the work of individuation, becoming the archetype of the whole man. Yet every true journey ends where all real journeys begin, within us, in the final act of radical acceptance. The story of the Pharaoh, his power, his fall, his rebirth, becomes the mirror the modern soul must dare to face. His legacy is not meant to be admired from afar. It is meant to be lived. The totality he discovered is our own self, waiting beneath the noise of the world to be found. He taught us that the greatest danger is not the judgment of society, the collective shadow demanding the perfection of the persona, but the judgment we impose on ourselves, the denial of our own Eros, our feeling, our intuition, in the name of social adequacy. His story asks us directly, what part of you was society afraid of? What power did you exile into shadow just to seem acceptable or strong? By integrating his darkest places, the Pharaoh offers one final psychological command: accept the shadow, not as punishment, but as the keeper of your buried strength. The tyranny of Logos once taught him to repress anger, doubt, vulnerability, but he discovered that tears, rage, tenderness, all of it is the language of the soul. Strength is not found in repression, but in wholeness. He proved that true authority belongs to the one who dares to be human, and humanity is the sacred union of reason with heart, of logos with eros. His transformation becomes the proof that final healing is spiritual autonomy. You are your own authority. You are your own proof. The totality he reached in the heart of his crisis became his liberation. His separation from external dependence, from power, from dogma, made his truth pure. His self became the source, the center, the masculine principle in motion. He reached the peace that emerges only through radical self-acceptance. The key he left us is not gold. It is the key of radical acceptance. He showed us that totality is not a reward, it is our destiny. If the Pharaoh's story touched the shadow you carry, if you feel the call to reclaim your voice and the wholeness waiting within you, your soul work must begin now. He gave us the key to totality, but the key must be used. Now, it rests in your hands. The Pharaoh's archetypal journey ends where every true journey begins, within us. He left us the key, not a key of gold, not a key of power or hierarchy, but a key of radical acceptance of our whole being. The Pharaoh, bearer of the integrated self, taught us the most vital truth. The greatest danger is not the world's judgment, the collective shadow, but the judgment we cast onto ourselves, the denial of our own eros, feeling, intuition, inner knowing, in the name of adequacy or strength. His legacy is not meant to be admired from afar. It is meant to be lived. The totality he reached is our own self, waiting patiently to be found. His story stands before us as a mirror and asks, what part of you did society force into hiding? What power did you condemn to shadow just to be seen as acceptable or strong? The Pharaoh's wisdom condenses into a single psychological command: accept the shadow, not as punishment, but as the doorway to the strength it carries. Strength is not born from repression, but from wholeness, from the union of reason and heart. He proved that final healing is spiritual autonomy. You are your own authority. You are your own proof. He became totality, and his life became the message. If the Pharaoh story touched the shadow you carry, if you feel the call to reclaim your voice and your inner wholeness, your soul work must begin now. Subscribe to Shadow Work Stories and activate the bell so you don't miss the next archetypal journey. Our channel isn't just about stories, it's about transforming what hurts into wisdom and what was silenced into voice. Leave your like if you too believe in the power of totality, and click the video now appearing on your screen to continue diving into the journey of the self. Remember, your self is waiting. Totality is your destiny.